Welcome and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few moments as people continue to come into the Zoom space. Hello again and welcome. My name is Timothy Borch. I work as Assistant Director for Transfer Student Services in the Office of Admissions at UC San Diego. Thank you for joining us today for Future Triton Weeks. Future Triton Week. Future Triton Week is a multi-day webinar series designed to assist you, prospective undergraduate students, with the UC admission process. We hope you were able to join us yesterday for our review of the UC application. Today, we have an interactive session in store for you surrounding the Personal Insight Questions, or PIQs for short. We are really excited that you are here with us today virtually. Next slide. I'd like to start by sharing that this webinar is being recorded. Next slide. Through Zoom, please utilize the Q&A feature to submit questions that you have. We encourage you to submit your questions anonymously as this is a public-facing event. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. In addition, closed caption is available via the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. Like yesterday's session, we have two of our amazing admissions officers who will help to dive deep into the personal insight questions. They will share more about the PIQS Basics, the purpose of the PIQs, review the prompts, and provide some tips and helpful information. And we will end with an interactive activity and Q&A session. With that, I'd like to invite both Pam and Eddie on screen to introduce themselves and to begin today's session.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is, thank you so much, Timothy, for that. My name is Eddie Morfin. I am an admissions officer here at UC San Diego. I am also a proud alum, so whoop, whoop, go Tritons. It's so great to be here with you all today and learn more about the PIQs when you're applying. So with that being said, I'll pass it on over to Pam.
Awesome. Thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Timothy. My name is Pam Franco. I'm an admissions officer here with UC San Diego. Really excited to connect with you all today and go through the personal insight questions. So next slide. Okay, so today we're going to go over a lot of different things. You can see we'll be discussing the PIQs in detail. So the basics, their purpose in the application, and we're even going to delve into case studies and helpful tips. And then finally, we're going to be rounding out today's session with a Q&A. Moving on. Okay, so what are the basics? First things first, there are 8 questions to choose from. 1 is going to be required. You have to respond to 4 total. So that's not 3, not 5 or 6, but 4. All students must submit 4 responses. There's also a 350-word maximum. Now keep in mind there's no minimum to write, but please make sure you do provide a complete response. We also recommend you double checking your word count because the UC application will only count up to 350 words and then we will cut off any extra. We don't want to be left hanging there when reading your response, which does happen sometimes. It's also important to keep in mind that all questions are of equal value. So there are no questions that are better to answer than others or ones that you feel like you should respond to besides that one required one. We want you to instead choose questions that reflect who you are and provide us with insight on your experience, environment, and overall circumstances. Keep in mind the personal insight questions, or PIQs, can be utilized for selection purposes depending on campus, and that UC campuses do not interview students or accept letters of recommendation. So the personal insight questions are perfect for you to share your stories and experiences with admissions representatives, like your challenges, achievements, and values. So it's really an opportunity to maximize your voice, to ask what makes you you, and to share that with us. And again, the focus should be on you. So feel free to use I statements and me, I went here, I did this, those type of words and statements. Moving on, please. Okay, so with that in mind, again, no letters of recommendation, no interviews. The purpose of the personal insight question answers, they should really be clear right now. They allow you to tell your story in your own words. So it helps admission readers understand what's important to you. And academic performance, keep in mind, is always going to be the most important part of the UC application. But we want to know not only how well you're doing in class, but why you made certain choices. We want to understand how you think beyond how you perform academically. Next slide. Okay, now keep in mind, the personal insight questions can be used in different ways, even on a single UC campus. So campuses can use them in selection, to award scholarships, or to help readers understand other parts of the application that might not be clear. So most students who apply to the UCs are competitive applicants, and the UCs are academically selective, so context is key. We're not going to be comparing you against other individual students. We are looking instead at your individual experiences and environment. So you're encouraged to provide context to help us understand your home, school, and community life. Essentially, what information will be helpful for admissions to know that we may not glean from elsewhere in the application? I'm going to pass it over to Eddie now.
Thank you so much, Pam. Well, thank you for that introduction to the PIQs. So now let's take a look and dive in a little deeper into the PIQs themselves and actually go through the prompts. So there's like Pam mentioned, there's going to be some various topics to choose from. And since they're all weighted equally, you're going to want to choose the ones that are most relatable to you. But before we do, you're going to notice on this on the screen that there's going to be some words that are either bolded, italicized, or underlined. And just know that we did that in a sense for a purpose, right? Because they are in a sense important. We want you to take note that these words from these prompts are going to be the ones that you want to use to kind of guide you to give us the response that in the sense we're looking for. So the first prompt that's going to be required for all transfer students is it reads, please describe how you have prepared for your intended major, including your readiness to succeed in your upper division courses once you enroll at the university. So this prompt, as you're transferring to UC San Diego, you have already been taking a wide breadth of general education courses. And once you're here, you're going to be focusing on those major specific courses at the upper division level. So we want to know how you've prepared for this major, whether it be maybe course selection that you've done, or maybe opportunities or involvements that kind of led you into choosing this major. And then as well as you want to make sure that you elaborate on how ready you are to go in deeper once you go into these upper division courses. Another prompt that you could potentially choose from is to talk about your leadership. So here this prompt reads, describe an example of your leadership experience in which you have positively influenced others, helped resolve disputes, or contributed to group efforts over time. So here you can consider, traditional as well as non-traditional forms of leadership. So you don't necessarily have to be in an official leadership position or role to choose this prompt. You can share experiences like maybe being a leader in your family or at school or in your community or your church. All of those experiences are valid. On the next slide, you'll see some other prompts that you can choose from. One of them touching upon what would you say is your greatest talent or skill? How have you developed and demonstrated that talent over time? So rather than defining terms, we ask for you to share your talent or skill and why it's meaningful to you. And just with many skills or talents, right, they sometimes don't happen overnight. So being able to share maybe the practices and the hard work that you have taken to achieve that would be something great to kind of highlight. Another great prompt that you can potentially choose from is to describe how you've taken advantage of a significant educational opportunity or worked to overcome an educational barrier that you have faced. So here you can talk about an academic enrichment program that you might have been a part of, or if there were educational barriers that you faced, how did you address them and overcome them? Or did you have support from others while doing that? Or did you navigate them on your own? So those are the things that you're gonna wanna probably highlight with this prompt. On the next slide, you'll see the other two that you can choose from. One of them talks about describing the most significant challenge that you might have faced and the steps that you have taken to overcome this challenge. How has this challenge affected your academic achievement? So here you want to make sure that you're elaborating on either a personal challenge or something that might be broader, but that has impacted you as the student. So similar to the previous prompt, how are you addressing this challenge and what strategies or resources did you utilize to overcome it? And how has that affected your academic experience and success overall? The other prompt that you can choose from is every person has a creative side and it can be expressed in many ways: problem solving, original and innovative thinking, and artistically, just to name a few, and describe how you express your creative side. So as the prompt highlights, right, creativity can be manifested in different ways. So you want to describe how has it manifested for you and the ways that you've been able to kind of express that creative side of yours. All right, and then the last two prompts that you could potentially choose from is what have you done to make your school or community a better place? Here, you would want to let us know, what that school or community looks like for you. In a sense, kind of define what that school or community is for you and what it means to you at the end of the day. And the reasons that, that made you want to make it a better place, right? And maybe describe an anecdote or an experience that you've kind of that you have had to kind of get to this point, in a sense, to making your school or community a better place. And then the last question that you can potentially choose from is, beyond what has already been shared in your application, what do you believe makes you stand out as a strong candidate for admission to the University of California? So this is where you're going to be able to brag about yourself, right? This is going to be an opportunity to uplift yourself. Let us know something that has not necessarily already been reported on the application. Maybe you can use this to answer something that you want to let us know, or you want to let admissions know, something that maybe was not asked on the application. So this is kind of where you want to utilize that space. But that key highlight there is beyond. A lot of the time students use this question to kind of summarize everything that's already been on the application. You want to make sure that you don't do that. You kind of want to highlight something that, like I said, you want the admission staff to know that was not potentially asked in the application. All right, so those are the 8 prompts that you can choose from. Like I said, you just need to choose, well, there's 1 required and the other 3 you can choose out of those 7. So like I said, they're all weighted equally at the end of the day. But also a great portion that you'll be able to use in the application is the additional comments. So there's going to be 2 sections in the application called the additional comments that are optional. These are optional, but you can definitely take advantage of to give us more context at the end of the day. There's going to be 1 right after the academic history and 1 right after the PIQs, and they both are a maximum of 550 words or characters, and that is including spaces. So in here, you're going to want to talk about things that you didn't want to focus a PIQ on, or you're going to be, like I said, providing context to your application. On the next slide, you'll kind of see examples of what that might be. So here you want to, potentially use them after your academic history, potentially to clarify unusual grading scales, especially if you're coming from an institution, maybe an international institution, or maybe another 4-year institution that had maybe not common grading scales. This is where you want to use that space to kind of describe that. And that's going to help us determine whether you successfully met, certain minimum requirements, or to accurately calculate your GPA. You can also use this space to clarify any course submissions, especially if it is that you're going for a major that requires major preparation. You can also choose to discuss the specific selection of one class over another, especially if there is that you have many class selections at your school being offered. This helps the reader to better understand your college offering. So sometimes you might have attended a community college or an institution that didn't necessarily have articulation agreements in place. Here's where or maybe not a lot of different course offerings. Here's where you want to use that space to kind of let us know about that as well. And we know that COVID-19 caused most schools to move to a virtual setting and instruction, and many colleges allow students to switch to pass, no pass grading scales. This would be a good place to kind of talk about those things as well when it comes to the grading from pass, no pass, or maybe the academic structure, if that's something that you wish to kind of elaborate on. And then another good way to kind of answer here in the additional comments is maybe explain any gaps in education is going to be important for you all to kind of highlight here as well. Especially if it is that you had any breaks in education, we're going to want to know kind of in a sense what was happening during that time, whether you were attending another institution or maybe you had a part-time job and things like that. Here's where you can kind of provide that context as well. And then also if you had potentially a dip in grades, that is another thing that you can add here in the academic history additional comment section. And especially if you for example, faced a hardship that maybe was not already addressed, here you can put that information there as well. On the next slide, you'll be able to see these are all acceptable ways to kind of expand for the PIQ additional comment section, we do want to highlight that this is not going to be kind of, in a sense, a fifth PIQ response that you're going to want to use for this. It should only be used to clarify or explain something that you didn't discuss either fully or that you just wanted to kind of briefly mention to us, that you don't want to use a PIQ for that. So, and like I said, all in all, it's going to be able to provide context to us that you weren't able to answer it in other sections in the application. All right, so with all that being said, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Pam. That's going to continue on with you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Eddie. So now we are going to segue into some case studies. We'll review the PIQ prompt, and after we'll discuss if we think it has added value or if it was a missed opportunity. So moving to the next slide, you might ask, what are the parameters for value added or missed opportunities? First, remember, there are no bad or good answers. Value added responses are those that add value to their application. They allow admissions to learn more about you. These can be entirely new topics not mentioned in the application, or maybe new or additional information about something briefly mentioned, like extracurricular activities, maybe a class that you took, a special program you were able to participate in. These should always include specific or tangible examples that focus on the decision, action, and impact of student. Whereas a missed opportunity are those that don't provide more information or context for admissions to consider in the comprehensive review. So some common mistakes are when you might reiterate information appearing in other parts of the application. Focusing on other people. There are so many times we've heard great personal insight questions talking about a grandparent or a relative, and at the end of the personal insight question, we feel like we know that grandparent really well and we don't know anything about the student. So focusing on other people is definitely a big missed opportunity there. Sometimes students aren't able to answer the question directly or elaborating on the circumstance, giving details that we need, with no specific or tangible examples. And sometimes they can be too creative, providing too much description that does not give the reader sufficient evidence. Sometimes students approach it, like a creative writing assignment and will answer in song lyrics or a poem. And while that's really exciting in terms of creativity, it's not necessarily exactly what we're looking for. So with that in mind, let us move on to the next slide. Okay, so case study A, the prompt. Describe an example of your leadership experience in which you have positively influenced others, helped resolve disputes, or contributed to group efforts over time. So we'll go to the next slide and I will read the answer, and then we'll discuss if we think it's added value or not. Okay. Coaching at Friday Night Lights for roughly 3 years has not only stimulated substantial personal growth in the realms of my administrative, management, and leadership abilities, but for those I've had the pleasure of coaching as well in the forms of collaboration, organization, and communication. Each season, I am assigned to roughly 8 children, usually from the ages of 6 to 10, which I lead autonomously for the entirety of a regular and playoff season. I determine a schedule of 2 practices per week in addition to the game each Friday, which is personalized to each family and their lives. I teach young ones fundamental skills that will help them succeed in games such as proper throwing, catching, route running, and defensive techniques. I establish a unique playbook of both offensive and defensive formations and help the players memorize the plays. Most importantly, I aspire to develop a positive environment for my players in which they benefit from healthy competition, exercise, and camaraderie. In other aspects of my life, I remain that same coach. I tutor native Spanish speakers in the English language. I founded a political chapter in my local area to promote the ideas of like-minded individuals. I advocated for and established the teenage faction of Mensa to build a stronger, more robust community. When qualified and capable, fulfilling leadership role is an opportunity I aspire for. To see those who you led succeed, whether it be scoring a touchdown, learning foreign vernacular, or anything in between, is a magnificent sight, which I strive for consistently and will continue to pursue. So before we move to the next slide, feel free to type and share out if you feel like this is value added or a missed opportunity. And if you're wild enough to share, if not, we'll just wait a second either way to give everyone a chance to kind of let the response seep in. But feel free to utilize the chat feature, the Q&A, to share if you feel like it is added value. Okay, looks like everyone is really quiet. That's okay. So let's see, someone thought maybe missed opportunity. Let's see, and move on. Let's move to the next slide and we can discuss what it is. So the actual conclusion, we felt like it was value added because there's relevant high school experience shared, but great detail with specific contextual information. So it outlined skills, time spent, the audience, and it benchmarks the students what the student looks to accomplish, excuse me. So it provides another example again at the end, and it ties it in effectively into the theme of the student's personal leadership style. So because it gave specifics, really structured and answered the question directly, we felt like it was value added. We learned something about the student's leadership skills in a very tangible way that we wouldn't have able to have learned otherwise in the application. Sometimes approaching them more like a written interview is a good way to approach these personal insight questions. And I think this is a good example of that. So let's move on to the next one. So the prompt itself is, what have you done to make your school or community a better place? So you know the routine now. We'll go to the next slide and I will read it out. Okay. Every other Saturday and Sunday, I tiptoe around tiny holes in the earth, shoveling gently and adding depth to the homes of tiny saplings. After 3 hours in the sun-drenched marshlands, I get to gaze out over a beautiful field of sagebrush, taking in the results of my 3 years volunteering at the land trust in my community. When I initially volunteered, I was worried that my general anti-dexterity would result in a disaster for the plants. On my first day, the groundskeeper asked for a volunteer to carry gigantic bags filled with watering cans to the work site. I was tempted to walk away to the wetlands as most other students had, but I figured this was a task even a clumsy gardener couldn't mess up, so I picked up 2 of the bags. Since that first day, I've continued carrying the bags for the groundkeeper and have learned to perform a variety of tasks. To beautify the ravine, I clear the litter. To prevent competition for water, nutrients, and sunlight, I pull weeds and invasive species. To give life to the plants, I fill the watering cans and pour. And to build the foundation for the greenery, I dig holes in the wetland grounds. Over time, I've developed more deftness in handling the plants. These tasks are lonely, but I find they can make me feel content, at peace. The land has markedly improved from my initial outings at the Trust, with an abundance of hardy quailbush and the vibrancy of coastal sunflowers and seaside buckwheat. Yet in 2020, it has become more difficult to tend to these plants as COVID and California wildfires have ravaged on. I still hold on to hope though. Lately, when I volunteered at the Land Trust, families stopped to admire the vivid and expressive plants that many of us tended to, and more than once, I've heard a child ask how she can help. When I hear this, I smile, knowing that as long as there are people who want to preserve Mother Earth, we'll be all right. Okay, so before moving on, let's ask, do we think this is added value or a missed opportunity? Are there specific examples given? Do we feel like we know more about the student? They might have listed this volunteering opportunity in the extracurriculars, but this is an example probably of where they've given a little bit more detail. So let's see, moving on to the next slide, if we feel like this is a value added. So we actually do. We feel like this is a really good example of individual contribution. Remember, the question was, what have you done to make your school or community a better place? The student chose to focus on their community, but they gave us a really strong example, recent experience, and they also provided detail on the amount of time spent, the nature of the activity, and pun intended, I guess, and how that contribution, is expanding, right? That children are kind of inquiring about volunteering themselves, and that cyclical nature of hopefully volunteering and spreading that, that good energy. It's a motivation. So we felt like this was value added. Now, those are 2 examples. I am going to transition back over to Eddie to round us out with the last case study. And let's see if we feel like this one will be a missed opportunity or a value added.
All right, thank you, Pam. Let's give Pam a break going over those case studies and finish off with this last case study that we have here. So like, Pam has kind of set for us, we're going to read, the prompt, then go into the response, and then go a little bit as far as, some added value or missed opportunities. So the prompt that this student chose to write about was, in a sense, every person has a creative side and it can be expressed in many ways: problem solving, original and innovative thinking, and artistically, to name a few. So describe how you express your creative side. All right, so let's go into the prompt itself. Like science, art can be explored without tremendous foundational knowledge and does not have boundaries. During the pandemic, I've had more time to delve deeper into my creative expression. In only the last few months, I have taught myself many art forms. I knitted a full-size blanket and crocheted tops. I discovered metal stamping, mandala making, and weaving. I have drawn, painted, embroidered, and made collages. I learned by trial and error using makeshift tools from around my house and starting over again and again. However, my greatest creative expression has been my art wall. This wall is an imperfect conglomeration of pictures representing thoughts that go through my mind. Scattered throughout this collection are various self-portraits. A marker drawing from April 2020 captures my despair as the world was in full lockdown and panic, but I'm looking at a tiny butterfly that represents hope. My room is now covered in butterflies. A watercolor portrait from July is done in rainbow colors, exuberant, as I've realized I possess successful tools to overcome my anxiety. Our cartoon strip of me interacting with organic molecule beings is silly, but help me clarify their functions, as online learning is often hard to digest. In a charcoal sketch, I'm sitting under a tree of life formed entirely from a mathematical proof. My wall is not just like a sketchbook or diary, but also how I reflect on problems, academic and otherwise. The art world and science world do not exist in isolation. Problem solving and innovation require creativity, not mindless understanding of a discipline. Even though my artistic side may not be what is first perceived about me, it is imperative of my thinking and will give me a broader creative STEAM perspective needed in my future endeavors. All right, a big piece, right, that we got there. Hopefully y'all were able to kind of capture some, some good things as well as maybe some missed opportunities things with this. So with that, we can definitely see that there was, some missed opportunities as we see on the next slide. This is definitely a good PIQ, right? But but it does miss, some missed opportunities, as there was some value added to this PIQ. So focusing a little bit more specifically, this student gives good examples of art forms, but does not provide any quantifiable information. So for example, like how many, maybe over what time period did the student exhibit anything online or in a gallery, for example? What was the process of this trial and error that the student kind of brought up? So those are maybe some things that she or he potentially could have gone into with this response. When the student talks about the art wall, that was very interesting, but lacks enough detail to explain how this wall helped the student overcome anxiety, as the student mentioned, right? The student mentions reflecting on problems, but doesn't explain how. Why does the butterfly represent hope to the student? That would have been a good way to kind of highlight that as well. So while the PIQ is good, it does leave some questions unanswered as well. So maybe those are things to kind of consider as you're kind of writing these prompts yourself. All right, so moving on to the next slide, we kind of finished our case study there. Now let's go into maybe some tips, as well as maybe some overall highlights from our presentation today. So remember, there is no perfect formula for a strong PIQ in a sense. Rather, you should focus on providing information and context about yourself that we don't otherwise have. There's no particular topic that you must write about, so we do encourage you to cover topics not mentioned elsewhere in the application. That's kind of where this PIQ gives you those opportunities. Leadership, one thing I will highlight, leadership is a broadly defined, right? So it's really going to come down to your interpretation of what that means. It doesn't necessarily have to be an official, position that you might have held for a club and organization. It could have been, maybe a leader of a sports team, or maybe a family responsibility, or even supporting your own self. You do have some leadership in there as well. So it's really up to your interpretation, but always bringing it back to yourself. You can write, within good reason, using your natural voice. This is not an academic essay. There's no need to stress about it. It is, and that's why we encourage you to kind of speak in the I state, using I statements when you're kind of writing these responses. And then while each response is brief, a lot can be said, okay? So there's no need for a lot of, the flourishing language, and maybe even a lot of the descriptive language there. A lot can definitely be said, and context can be provided with, just that brief response. You wanna avoid any repetition. If something has already been addressed elsewhere in the application, use this space for either a different topic or maybe highlighting, a different perspective if it is that you're gonna be talking about the same topic. And then we do consider content, not necessarily the structure. So once again, there's no, you don't have to necessarily impress us with your writing skills when it comes to like either some poetry, maybe comedy, or any creative writing and things like that. On the next slide, you're just going to see what the PIQs are really all about. There are going to be an opportunity for you to showcase yourself, right? Whether it be your interests, your experiences, your highlights. While you're not expected to capture your entire life, in one or the 4 PIQ responses, you can provide a snapshot of these pieces of your life, right? These responses are personal because they really are about you, right? We want to know, who you are as a student, as a person. And when we review these responses, the PIQ kind of gives us those components of who you are as an applicant. On the next slide, you're going to see that PIQs are not an audition piece, right, or a portfolio piece that when you're applying with us. So it's not necessarily a sample of your writing styles, to us at the admissions. They're not academic essays where you have to, like I said, have the intro or the concluding sentences or any like hooks in a sense to kind of capture our attention. Your vocabulary should be correct, do a little spell check there, but you want to make sure that you're also using words that you normally use. That's going to be a good advice. That's how you're going to be able to keep it in that I statement form, right? And finally, they should not be a complex survey of your life. Rather, than listing life events, you should focus on maybe 1 or 2 examples in each way to kind of provide highlights when we're reviewing your application, okay? All right, so with all that being said, hopefully y'all were able to get some good information there. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Timothy that's gonna be able to close us off and lead us into our Q&A.
Well, thank you both, Eddie and Pam, for this very thorough presentation on the PIQs. Our team members behind the scenes took care of answering many of the questions that were submitted in the Q&A feature, but there are some additional questions. And I would like to invite all of our participants to continue to use the Q&A to submit questions, personal insight questions, or even any questions that you have about the application itself. With that being said, I do want to dive into this first question. And the first question reads, and this will be for you, Pam, are prompts usually available before the application opens?
Yeah, so that's a softball question. Yeah, they are open before the application. So we actually really don't change the personal insight questions often. And someone in the chat will be able to drop the link for just the general website that we have through University of California admissions that goes into each of the personal insight questions and how you want to approach it. But they are always available through our website. So you can definitely prepare before the submission period, and keep in mind the application always opens August 1st, even though the submission period is the month of November. So you can fill out everything in the application August 1, but you can't click that submit button until, well, now, but you can definitely prepare. And we do recommend for personal insight questions that you prepare before you go in and start working on the application. So you think about which questions you want to answer. You write out at least one draft, you get that ready, maybe in a Google document or a Word document. And then when you go into the application, it'll be a much simpler copy and paste situation.
Thank you, Pam. That's very helpful. The next question comes in, Eddie, and I think this would be a good question. And all the questions are great questions, by the way. Should the PIQ be split into multiple paragraphs?
Very good question. There's really no need to be doing, multiple paragraphs like we kind of highlighted. They're not meant to be like essays or, like where you have to have topic sentences and like a thesis statement. I know that's probably going to be something you're going to do once you're already at UCSD with maybe some of your classes, but not necessarily when it comes to the PIQs themselves. They're really meant to be short responses. They're a maximum of 350 words, like Pam kind of mentioned earlier. So at the end of the day, you kind of want to get straight to the point. There's no need, of course, don't have run-on sentences also. You also want to make sure that it kind of makes sense. It's going to be important for you to maybe have someone can maybe proofread them, maybe give you a little bit of feedback, someone that you trust that you want to kind of share those responses with, but there's not going to be a need to kind of do it in multiple paragraphs. Of course, it's your writing style, however you choose to write it, but there's not going to be a need for that when it comes to formality or anything like that. So yeah, that's kind of where, there's no need for the multiple paragraphs.
Thanks, Eddie. I appreciate that. For the next question, Pam, the question reads, for example, with leadership experience, can we put 2 or more experiences or just focus on 1 or 2 leadership experiences in the PIQ that focuses on leadership?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the situation. 350 words to some students feels like a lot, and it's, how can I fill up 350 words with just answering this question? Whereas other students, it feels like, oh my gosh, I only have 350 words. So I think it depends, first of all, about your personal leadership experiences. We do want to know things that are relevant, things that give us more context. So if there is more than one leadership example that you feel demonstrates all of those things, and you can tie it all in, similar actually to one of the case studies that we went through. The student did mention more than one leadership activity. It's totally fine to do that. Just make sure that you are answering the question, that you are giving us the information that we need, and it's not just a list pretty much of different leadership experiences, that you do give us that context and detail and explain to us what it entailed in terms of hours, what you did, the impact moving forward, what you plan to do, if it inspired you. So if you can fit a few things in there, go for it. And some students are very succinct, very able to edit it down and share a lot of really relevant information in a short amount of words. And if you are able to do that and can do it concisely, go for it. But if you find yourself kind of stumbling and realizing that you need to focus on just one leadership example and really go into detail on it, know that that's totally fine too.
Thanks, Pam. The next question we have was touched on a little bit, but Eddie, perhaps you can elaborate a little bit further. The question reads, how much detail should I go into for the required question? And it further states, I don't want to give detail that is too specific to my major and would be lost to the reader. How would you advise that student?
I mean, honestly, that's kind of what the question's all about, right? We really want to know, especially because coming in as a transfer student, you have to come in declaring that major, right? So it's going to give us that context as far as, how you prepared for the major. So maybe even if you think it might be too much detail, that's what's going to be that in a sense is going to give us that detail that we're looking for. So I don't think there's a wrong answer for that when it comes to it. If you choose to, the question itself is really asking about the preparation and the readiness that you're going to have once you're already here. So I think going into detail is going to be helpful for that question.
Great, thanks, Eddie. And the next question, we talked a little bit about it during the presentation. It's specifically about the word count. Pam, can you talk a little bit about how important the word count is? I know we talked about cutting and pasting, and could there be shorter answers that might be good?
Definitely. So yes, there can be. I feel like I can distinctly remember one year reading one that was about 270 words, and it was really good, to the point. I felt like I got the information I needed. The student answered the question. There were no flourishes, no fancy intros or hooks or anything like that. They just kind of dove right in, but you definitely can. Keep in mind, while you can have a good answer that's shorter, you can't have a good answer that's longer, because we do cut you off at 350 words. So you don't want to be left hanging. Make sure that you don't exceed that total maximum word count, because if we don't know the conclusion of your essay, that can give us a little bit of, 75% of the pie, so to speak.
Very good. Thank you, Pam. That's very helpful. Eddie, for the next question, the student asked a little bit about clubs and honors classes and things of this nature. The question reads, does lack of being able to be active in clubs, honors classes, and internships in community college affect the application in general?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's important to kind of know, who a transfer student is, right? And a transfer student can look, honestly, there's not one cookie cutting, mold of what one transfer student is. So we are very understanding that, if you had, a life experience that didn't give you that much opportunity to be involved or being into these extracurriculars. Maybe you had family responsibilities. Maybe you had to do, you had to work full time while going to school and things like that. We're very understanding of all those experiences. So in a sense, you not having certain experience or involvement would not have a negative impact when it comes to your application. That's why it's going to be important to utilize the PIQs to give us that context, right? Maybe if it is that you weren't able to participate in certain things like that, maybe you can either add it in the PIQ or maybe in the additional comments as to maybe if there is a reason for that, you can definitely include it in there as well, but definitely not. I mean, at the end of the day, your academics are important, but also all the other aspects of your application is going to be important as well to give us your life experience. There's not one cookie cutting experience or definition of a transfer student.
Very well said. Thank you, Eddie. I want to address a question that came in, if I may, just very quickly. A student asks if we, the admissions office, are available to review the PIQs before students submit them. And the best way to answer this question is, and it was mentioned a little bit during the presentation, we would encourage you to reach out to your counselor at the community college, or if you're at another four-year university, or maybe a trusted faculty member or a friend, parent, guardian, older sibling, uncle. That's who we would recommend that you reach out to if you really want to try and put your best foot forward with the PIQs. The admissions officer is not going to really be in a position to offer you any insight because we don't know you. So we would suggest that you connect with somebody that you trust, somebody that knows you, to really take a look at that PIQ. Of course, you as the student are responsible to create and to write the personal insight question responses. But we definitely recommend checking in with somebody that you trust to make sure that you did in fact paint an accurate picture. So thank you for that wonderful question. So the next question is, and this will be for you, Pam, when working on the questions, the personal insight questions, I discussed how I could bring skills, passions to the UC. Is that fine to discuss at the end of the question? I believe that's the question.
Yeah, so there are a few of the personal insight questions where I feel like discussing your skills and passions are a little bit more relevant. So that one question that's beyond what you've already shared in your application, what you believe makes you stand out as an applicant. The other one that might fit obviously is, describing your greatest talent or skill. So both of those, obviously you're really answering that question. It wouldn't be as relevant if you're talking about that for making your school or community a better place, right? So first and foremost, make sure you are answering the question. But if it is one of those questions where it's relevant, definitely, highlight your skills, talents, give us your challenges that you've overcome or opportunities you've had that will help us know you better. From your point of view, what makes you feel like you're an excellent candidate for the UCs. So we do want you to share that with us. Just make sure it's in the right questions, right? A creative, you can kind of approach that one with, I guess, the creative side as well. But in terms of talking about your skills and passions, I think those two prompts that I highlighted are going to be ones that you might want to bring that up with a little bit more specifically. But otherwise, definitely feel free to brag about yourself. I always tell students to be your own cheerleader during this because we don't get to hear it from counselors' letters of recommendations or from interviews with you. It really is just the application. So feel free to be your own advocate and really be your own cheerleader.
Great, thanks, Pam. Eddie, the next question is, it's talking a little bit about some of the case studies that you and Pam both provided about missed opportunity. The student asks, if one of the responses is considered a missed opportunity, does this mean that it is not a good response, and could that affect their application? How would you respond to that question?
Very good question. Honestly, there's no really wrong answer when you're writing these responses. At the end of the day, the reason why we kind of have those case studies was just to kind of give you a good insight as far as maybe what goes, in the thoughts of a mind of someone that is reading the application, because One thing I will highlight especially when we're reviewing all applications, that we can never assume. As an admissions officer, unless you mention it clearly on the application, we can never, in a sense, assume, like, even if it is that you're kind of going towards that way, but you didn't specifically say it, we can't assume. So that's why we kind of have these type of examples where, like, maybe here's where you could ask or answered a little bit more further, right? Clarified something, because as a reader, we're sometimes left wondering a little bit more, like, why? Oh, this person mentioned this. I wish they would elaborate a little bit more. So at the end of the day, there's no wrong answer. It will not negatively impact your application if it is that there was considered a missed opportunity. We're just letting you know potentially ways where you can elaborate a little bit more to give us more insight as far as who you are. And at the end of the day, like I said, it's not meant to say like, oh, this response is right and this one's wrong. It's just more so an opportunity for you kind of engage a little bit more with your responses.
Great, thank you, Eddie. Pam, this next question is a good question. The question is about the required question for transfer students about preparing for their major. The question is, well, what should I focus on? And the question further goes on, should we focus on past experiences that the student was engaged in, or should they focus on present experiences that they're now doing, but not very many? Can you talk a little bit, maybe just elaborate just a little bit further on that required question?
Definitely. So there are a few things to consider with this one. First, how did your interest in the major develop? I always think that's a really good way to kind of begin to frame the answer to that question. And then go into, do you have any experience related to your major outside of the classroom? Maybe you've had volunteering experience. Maybe that's how you got started. That was your passion for a subject. Maybe you're applying to be an environmental biology major and you got into it by volunteering at a beach cleanup. Letting us know, all of those different kinds of experiences. Maybe you had internships or employment. Maybe you were able to participate in student organizations and activities. We also understand that, transfer students, you have your own lives, you have jobs, responsibilities, families, and you might not have had those traditional opportunities. And if you haven't had experience in the field, that's okay. Consider your experience in the classroom and kind of go back to that. And that might include working with faculty, doing research projects, getting really involved in your major, and keep in mind, you are encouraged to apply broadly across the UC system. So if you're applying to multiple campuses with different majors at each campus, and you're trying to write this one personal insight question answer, my best recommendation would to think about, probably approaching it slightly broader, or finding that one common thread that you can kind of discuss in detail that threads throughout all of those majors. So I think first and foremost, when in doubt, go back to your classroom experiences, but think about your passion, where it started, and anything outside of the classroom that might tie into what your major is.
Great, thank you, Pam. And again, thank you for all these great questions. Continue to send in the questions. We're opening it up for really any kind of application question. We have about 12 minutes left, and you have 2 excellent admissions officers who can respond to these questions during this session. Eddie, the next question is actually interesting, as all of them are. I worked full-time for over 5 years and could only take 1 class a semester. The question goes on, are PIQ questions a good place to dive into this, or should I just sum it up in the additional comments section?
Very good question. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how you want to kind of express it, because you can use both either the PIQ or the additional comments. That's kind of what the purpose of both of them are. Now, if you feel the whole application itself is going to be one piece, right? So if you end up mentioning, in your employment history, kind of like the time period that you've been, started working, and if it is that you're currently working and things like that, it lets us know that time period also. So you don't have to elaborate too much in that. But if there's a reason why you're working full time, maybe if it is that you're supporting your family, or maybe if it is that, that really caused you to not be full time in school, those are things that you also want to highlight too, because like I said, it gives us context as far as who you are as a student. So potentially you can go both ways. The PIQ, if you want to elaborate, if there's good reason as to why it is that you're working full time, taking just one class each semester, go for it. Or if it is that you just want to let us know, the additional comments would be a good section for that too.
Great, thank you, Eddie. Pam, this next question reads, do we have to mention 1 or 2 specific examples for those PIQ questions? I know it's been discussed a little bit, but would you mind elaborating a little bit further?
Yeah, so I do recommend giving specific examples. Whether it's one specific example or multiple will be up to you. You know, keep in mind every application and therefore every personal insight question answer is going to be unique because it's supposed to reflect who you are, and you as a person obviously are unique. So I know we kind of sound like a broken record in that sense, but it is really true. You know, if you have one great creative skill and you've been honing, you know, your watercolor skills from the time you were 5, and that's what you want to talk about, and you're going to give us all of that detail from when it started, how many hours you put in, you know, anything that you've done outside of the classroom that's tied to that, and now your major is going to be, you know, art history or something, that's totally fine. But if you want to give us a creative writing answer that, or creative answer, excuse me, for the creative skill or talent one, that's like 4 or 5 examples, that's fine too. I think it is really important to remember that it's again, your application. So if you feel like there is more than 1 or 2 specific examples you want to tell us, feel free to, but I would encourage you to share at least 1 specific example. And if you're talking about extracurriculars or volunteering, give us a time frame, give us the amount of hours potentially. We want to know what you're doing outside of the classroom, and that detail will really help us.
Great, thank you, Pam. Eddie, the next question, it reads, can I include activities and volunteering from high school if I'm a community college transfer student? How would you respond to that question?
I mean, honestly, it's really up to the applicant, because I feel like if that experience has kind of grown over time, especially if you started something in high school and like you kind of developed that, maybe continued it at the community college level, or maybe if it was just something that you did in high school that has had a huge impact, of course, we want to know about it, because that is a part of who you are as an applicant, right? So maybe having that involvement opportunity in high school, like I said, you know, you kind of grew from that. Maybe that's where your interest in a particular major started. Maybe that's in the particular interest as to maybe where you want to venture as a career wise and things like that. It can definitely bring in value like that. But at the end of the day, we want to focus, you know, within your, you know, your years in college, right? Your current situation. And a lot of times when it comes to high school students, when they're applying, you know, sometimes they talk about things that happened when they're in elementary, like, okay, well, is it relating to you right now as an applicant right now? You know, so if if the answer is yes, then for sure talk about it. And especially in those high school experiences and involvement, I feel like there's a lot of enriching experiences that we gain from them. So if that's something that you feel is relevant to you as an applicant today, go for it. That's something you can definitely talk about.
Thank you, Eddie. You know, that required question on the application, it's generating a lot of questions, and reasonably so. It's people want to really understand what the nature of that question is. And Pam, you've really answered wonderfully how the student should approach this question. The question that we just received talks a little bit about, well, if students are taking the major preparation for a major, so in other words, does it make sense for students to talk about the classes that they've taken to prepare for the major if all the other students who are in that same major are also taking those same courses? The question, or I guess the essence of the question is there anything else you would like to share at this point regarding that required question that might help to provide some guidance for students so that they know, okay, this question, I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on it?
Yeah, so I think just listing the classes, or, you know, saying that I took the prereqs, like, we're going to know that, we're going to see your academic history, right? You're going to be including your college courses, your self-reporting everything. And if you're applying to a CAP major with us, those prereqs are built in as a requirement. So we know that you would have them. I think when we talk about going back in the classroom, when I was mentioning it earlier, it was more, you know, did you connect with a professor and did something spark that desire? Did it go from just a class to, I want this to be my major and my career? So kind of that initial spark of curiosity for the major, that initial spark of, you know, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. A little bit more like that. Maybe you were also doing some research on campus, right? Maybe your final project for a class was really, really interesting to you, and that really solidified that this is what you want to do with your career. So I think it's a little bit more like that, because again, we are going to know that you've taken those prereq courses. So you don't want to waste too much of those 350 words elaborating on something we already see. It's more of your thought process behind it, right? Why are you choosing this major? What's interesting about it to you? And if you aren't able to share outside experiences, you know, inverting back to the classroom with those thoughts in mind, I think is probably the best way I would approach it. I don't know if Timothy or Eddie have anything extra to add, but I think if you focus on that, it's going to lead you in the right direction.
I think that's really well said, Pam, and I appreciate that extra elaboration. And of course, if students have any additional questions after the presentation, we'll be providing some of our contact information. You're more than welcome to connect with us after the presentation. Also, if you have additional questions that did not come up during this workshop. So there's another question, Eddie. Aside from not adding value, or aside from the adding value component to the PIQs, are the answers, the PIQ answers, do they affect the admission consideration in any other way?
Very good question. So I do want to, like, in a sense, highlight that, in a sense, anything that you end up reporting won't negatively impact your application. It like kind of mentioned in the question, it's only going to add value. So at the end of the day, if it is that, you know, there's not going to be something that you write that's going to make us, oh, we're not going to admit this student, you know, that never happens. It's really good. Those spaces are really just opportunities for you to kind of like let us know who you are as an applicant. You know, like Pam mentioned, we wish we had the opportunity of meeting with you all one-on-one in an interview format, but we just don't have that opportunity. So that's where these PIQs are going to be able to let us know. It will never negatively impact if, you know, whatever you might say or affect your admission in that way. Okay.
Thank you, Eddie. You know, I want to tackle this next question that came in. The question is, do you think I can talk about my past bachelor's degree in another country related to my major now? This is a fantastic question. We get this a lot. Actually, we would encourage you to reach out to the Office of Admissions after this workshop, maybe tomorrow. If a student already has a bachelor's degree, they're actually not eligible for admission to UC San Diego as an undergraduate student. Now, you might be thinking, well, if my bachelor's degree was completed in another country, then that shouldn't count. But the truth of the matter is that it most likely will count. So we would definitely encourage you to connect with an admissions officer. We have available virtual advising and phone and email as well. We'll connect you to an admissions officer who can really address that question. But I wanted to let everybody on the call today know that if a student already has a bachelor's degree, they're no longer eligible for undergraduate admissions. However, graduate school might be a great option. In the remaining 3 minutes that we have, Eddie and Pam, if you wouldn't mind just kind of summing up, not only with the PIQs, but in general, are there any last minute tips and guidance that you would provide to all of our attendees today with regard to submitting that application?
Yeah, I'll go first. First, don't stress too much. The personal insight questions can always add value, but they will never negatively impact your application, as Eddie shared. So at the end of the day, don't stress out too much about the personal insight questions. And my other piece of advice, not necessarily related to the PIQs, but just inputting your coursework, is double check everything. Don't go based on memory.
That was going to be my tip, Pam, because I cannot stress enough how, you know, especially we are, as admissions officer, we go through the full application cycle. So when you apply, after you apply, when decisions are out, and there's a lot of times where students kind of, you know, sometimes put like, well, you know, they base off on maybe memory or based off on other things. You want to make sure that you're putting exactly the information that is on your transcript. No matter if you think that, you know, your grading scale might be different or anything like that, you want to make sure it's exact same, because we in the end are the ones that are kind of reviewing it and able to match up that information correctly. But like, you know, Pam mentioned, don't stress too much about it. You want to make sure that you're connecting with your transfer center, your counseling department at your school, just to make sure if you want to do a little good overview, as well as us, if you want to connect with us, because I know a lot of the times you might hear something from your counseling office, but then you might hear something different when you're contacting the admissions office. It's always good to go to both, right? Because you want to maybe solidify that information, especially if you're going for a particular major that might require major preparation. You know, you want to make sure that you're connecting with the campus, making sure you're double checking that everything kind of is in check. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. We're here to really help you navigate this application process, especially if this is your first time going about it. We're here as a resource for you. So don't get discouraged, that's what our main goal is for today, okay? But good luck to you all applying. That's basically my final tip here.
Well, thank you both, Eddie and Pam, for answering all of these questions. You've both been extremely helpful today. To our attendees, here we have UC San Diego Office of Admissions contact information, and it was also placed in the chat. We encourage you to take a screenshot for easy access. You can email our office at admissionsreply@ucsd.edu and explore our website at admissions.ucsd.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you tomorrow during our next session for Future Triton Week, the college system session. That's going to be a really great session, so tune in for that. Best of luck with your application. Take care and go Tritons.